The coronavirus pandemic affects all of us, whether or not you've had the virus itself. If you have and are still experiencing the long tail of symptoms, then the pressure on mental health can be severe. Are you experiencing mental health issues, or perhaps someone you know? Let's talk about it, because talking is one of the best tools we've got. Unlike the long tail of COVID symptoms that I talked about in my last couple of films, mental health has been a big talking point since early in the pandemic, more or less since when the lockdown started, and there are some very, very good reasons why. In fact, so many I've had to write them down, so excuse me whilst I read. Starting with probably the biggest and most serious. People have lost friends, family, colleagues to the virus itself. There has been a huge degree of bereavement. People are losing their jobs or their ability to work. People are confined to their living space, sometimes in difficult or even abusive relationships. The future is uncertain and scary. If you work in hospitality, travel, entertainment or retail, you're not even sure if you're going to have a job to come back to. And that's because there is a huge recession looming. I think we maybe had some inkling that this might happen when the pandemic broke out, but the reality of that is now, I think, starting to hit home. Maybe we can't see our parents, older relatives or other vulnerable people who are dear to us, and they can't see us either. And I haven't even spoken about the personal health implications. There is a huge fear of the virus itself from those out there who haven't yet caught it. And from those who have, they're trying to deal with an infection either themselves or someone in their household. And there's something else too, grief. I think all of us are feeling some degree of grief because the world we used to know is essentially gone. And it won't be coming back. And then, as I'm going to talk about in a little bit more depth later on, how do the 1 in 20 of us, as it's coming to be known, who are still struggling with the long tail of COVID symptoms, manage to keep our heads above water when we're still battling this incredibly debilitating condition post-infection? Now, mental health issues can take a variety of forms, and I'm not going to make some kind of exhaustive list, but rather talk about the primary form that most people think about and experience when we talk about mental health, and that is depression. What is depression? That is a really good question. Here's a list of symptoms from the NHS. I won't read through them all, but I will say this. Depression is harder to pin down than a set of symptoms. You can't look at that list and understand what someone who's experiencing it is feeling. I say this from experience, as my idea of what it was for the first 38 years of my life was very different to the reality when I finally experienced it. Maybe it's like Burning Man, where you have to have been there to know what it's like. Or maybe that's a terrible metaphor, I don't know, I've not been to Burning Man. Here's a metaphor that I sometimes use to describe it, and people who maybe haven't understood the condition before get a little bit of a handle on what it might feel like when I describe it to them in these terms. So, for the first 38 years of my life, I, like everybody else around me, was on the back of this boat, sailing along. Big party boat, there's a big deck, there's some music pumping, everyone's out there on the deck having a wonderful time, living life the way that most of us do on a day-to-day level. We don't necessarily realise that there's anywhere that isn't on this party boat, and to us maybe it doesn't even feel like a party. But to some of us there comes a time when we fall overboard and we are bobbing around in the water and we can see everybody else on that party boat having a wonderful time, and suddenly we feel detached. We can sort of see them up there, we can remember what it feels like to be there, but we're not there anymore. And nor do we feel like we're connected to the rest of the world going about their daily business. As the depression gets worse, maybe you are struggling to stay afloat and you start to actually go underwater. That first stage of going underwater, you can still see the sort of the blurry shape of the boat and the people above it. You can still hear this gentle thud, thud, thud of the music, but it's becoming a little bit more distant. You're starting to forget what it feels like to even be there to operate normally, and the rest of the world feels that much further away. You sink down a little bit further, you can no longer see the boat. You sink down further again and the light starts to fade. You can't even see the light at the end of the tunnel or the shards of sunlight coming down through the water. And that's the point at which you no longer start to even see the light coming down, that depression becomes really severe. And I think one of the misconceptions kicking around out there about what depression is that it's all in the head. And mine and a lot of other people's experiences of it certainly are not consistent with that. Depression can be felt as a kind of a driving, burning, churning kind of pain that exists somewhere in here. And that pain is a very physical manifestation. It is real. And this pain drives so much of your thinking that your thinking itself becomes distorted. It may be irrational, upset, angry, impulsive even. And a lot of the time we don't even realize that we're thinking that way or behaving that way. It is a condition that really sneaks up on you. The way I first realized I had an issue was when I was persuaded to take an online test. And I took the Beck online inventory as a test, which is actually a very reasonable tool, providing you are honest with yourself about the answers that you give. Now, I scored 38 on the first time I did that test, which is at the very high end of severe depression. And here was me going into that experience thinking, I'm a reasonable person, previously perhaps, believing that I didn't have a problem. Our own previous life experiences, or baggage if you like, determine a lot of the way that as individuals we react to that pain of depression. Many of us become withdrawn, others may become moody or confrontational. And when people self-harm, it doesn't make a lot of sense on the outside, but when you actually put yourself into the space of somebody who's feeling that kind of pain, the application of a lesser, more controllable pain that takes away the attention from this all-consuming inner pain actually becomes kind of logical. One thing that you certainly can say about depression is that there are no hard and fast rules, apart from everyone's experience is kind of shit. So, let's talk a little bit about COVID-related post-viral fatigue and the impact that that can have on mental health. It's well acknowledged that depression is one of the common symptoms of post-viral fatigue. What's less well researched is whether this is due to some biochemical responses to the condition itself, or whether it's a psychological response to the debilitating nature of the symptoms and the impact on our lives. It may ultimately be some combination of both. Now, of course, these studies don't exist yet, but it seems anecdotally that your average COVID PVFS case may be somewhat more severe than an Epstein-Barr or viral pneumonia triggered post-viral fatigue case. So it wouldn't be surprising at all, especially against this wider background of global pandemic and the pressure that that puts on our mental health, that some of us who are suffering from this long tail of COVID symptoms may now be struggling to deal with mental health issues, whether or not we've experienced them before. Now, I'm not a mental health professional, but I can talk a little bit about how it's affected me. Before COVID, to use my previous analogy, I had come up from the depths of the sea, and I'd built myself a dinghy, and I wasn't back on the party boat, but I had my dinghy, I was mostly dry, I had a pair of oars, and I was rowing where I wanted to go. That is to say, I had a purpose and a direction, and I felt like, I was kind of okay with what I was doing in life, if not back to the kind of 100% robust place that I might have experienced before. This was largely, and the dinghy was sort of built out of two primary coping mechanisms. And those coping mechanisms were productivity, that is to say, my ability to get on with a day's work, feel like I have achieved something that is valuable and worthwhile, and also exercise. Before COVID, I was training for the London Marathon, so I was running on average an hour every day, and 3 of those runs, so half of the runs every week, would have been real hard training runs, the sort that leave you exhausted but feeling brilliant. Then I caught COVID, and the subsequent fatigue pretty much eliminated both of those two coping mechanisms. So when you remove some of these coping mechanisms, you cope for a little bit, but the effect kind of builds over time. And after 3 or 4 weeks or so, I noticed that the waves outside my dinghy were getting choppy, I was getting splashed, I was getting wet, and it didn't take too long from that point until, I had my first capsize event. So what are the feelings that contribute to this? The ones that build without those coping mechanisms? Again, there's quite a few. Excuse me with my brain fog because I've had to write them down. Frustration. Every day you want to get on with stuff, but you wake up just feeling too shit, basically. Another day passes and you've not managed to achieve anything. And then what happens is you feel bad about yourself, you feel like you're a failure, and you're not good enough. And this is one of the things that this little voice is common to people who've experienced depression. I mean, some people call it a little voice, some people refer to it as a troll under the bridge that sort of comes out and starts shouting at you. But a lot of people will describe this inner monologue that is extremely negative, that starts to basically take any thoughts you might have and twist them according to this negative perspective. People around you might want help or assistance, and then you're unable to give it. You feel selfish. Maybe you don't tell people you're suffering because you don't want to in some ways seem weak or something like that. Then the pressure of not having told those people that maybe you're still struggling grows, and then you feel like a fraud. After weeks, there's still no progress and you have no idea when you're going to get better. When's it going to happen? Is there ever going to be a day that you wake up without a banging headache? Worry. Will there be a day where you can make plans for later that day or maybe the following day or the next week and know that you'll actually have confidence that you'll be able to do them? When will this recovery take place? How will it manifest? Uncertainty. Will you be able to go out and maybe enjoy a walk to the park or a trip slightly further afield and not have to worry about needing to crash or lie down and sleep in the middle of it? Insecurity. Will you be able to go back to work? Right now, could I handle a week of getting up at 7 o'clock in the morning, commuting into work, doing an 8 to 10 hour workday, commuting home, dealing with all the rest of cooking dinner, dealing with life admin, all the rest of that pressure? No, I barely could get through a day, and if I managed to get through to the end of that day, it would wipe me out for the rest of the week. No way. Pressure. What about all of those plans that you had for April, May, June? All of those days out you had, events you wanted to go to. For me, marathons I wanted to run. Can't do them anymore. Loss. What's it like when you've got kids or dependents of any kind? How can you care for them when it's a huge struggle just to look after yourself or get through your own day? This isn't my situation, so I don't have experience of that. I can't even imagine how difficult that would be. The longer it goes on, the greater the pressure builds. The list of undone tasks gets longer and the bank balance depletes whilst there's no income coming in to replenish it. So we've got a brutal recipe here of the background of global pandemic: uncertainty, unrest, recession, debilitating illness, potential direct symptom of depression itself, and the consequential life impact with no obvious relief or light at the end of the tunnel. There is a huge amount here that is contributing, probably unlike any other time in our lives. Previous generations lived through the world wars and were scarred by them. Mental health issues weren't really acknowledged or believed in and were brushed off. That's not so much the case now. So, let's talk a little bit about what we can do about it. Now, there are books, academic papers, online tutorials, and probably cookbooks that have been written by many more esteemed people than me on the subject. So rather than offer clinical advice, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tricks and easy wins that have helped me. Now, whilst my previous level of productivity and exercise may have gone out of the window as coping mechanisms, that doesn't mean they need to be scratched from the list altogether, just reframed. With depression or post-viral fatigue, or the combo of both, there is going to be an impact on what you can do in a day. If you're used to getting a lot done, this might come as a bit of a shock. The first part here is acceptance. Accept your new level, whatever it is. You might need to grieve the old one. But don't worry, do the right things, be patient, and it will come back. Then make lists. Make them easy, make them long, and stick things on that you've already done. I'm talking about really banal stuff here. For example, the first thing on my daily list is breakfast and coffee. Literally, it's on there because just to even get going, I already score a tick and I already get something done. Your daily list might look like this. It might be that simple. Reward yourself for doing the things that you wouldn't even normally consider as tasks, because with depression and post-viral fatigue, and maybe both, these things are hard. Now, other people won't get it. It won't necessarily appear from the outside that taking a shower is something that requires a huge amount of effort and may actually tire you out for some period of time afterwards. Be patient with them and encourage them to be patient with you. Or maybe, give them a link to this film if they can stand me going on about it. The great thing about making lists like this is that you get to realize that actually you have done things which were difficult. You just have to reframe your idea about what a difficult or a busy day looks like. This isn't your fault. This is not some failure of you to achieve the things you used to be achieving. You really have to change your mindset around what the new normal actually is. So you get to the end of a day like this, you've ticked everything off the list, and you know what? 100% productive. Brilliant. As discussed in my last film, exercise is a tricky one with PVFS. You can exercise yourself out of depression, but not out of post-viral fatigue. But don't become completely sedentary if you can help it. Try and find a comfortable, low level of exercise that doesn't trigger post-exertional malaise. Maybe this is as simple as having a cup of tea, going downstairs, putting the kettle on, making a brew and sitting down with it. That might be the level of activity we're talking about. If you can get outside and get some fresh air, I really think that's good. Have that cup of tea outside if the weather's nice. If you can bear to go for a walk, go for a walk. And the other thing here that's a useful tool, if you're able to exercise at a slightly higher level, maybe even a gentle jog, if you've got a heart rate monitor, it might be quite useful to make use of that. This is a nice way of quantifying the level of exercise and its impact on your body when otherwise it's so hard to judge. I always used to be a bit of a meditation cynic, but meditation has become one of my key coping mechanisms with depression and now post-viral fatigue. Using my party boat and dinghy metaphor, if I feel my dinghy rocking about a little bit too much, if I'm feeling a little bit edgy, I know that I need to sit myself down, get myself my meditation app on and spend 5 or maybe tops 10 minutes just sitting down with the app. Now, I use and can recommend both Buddhify and Headspace for this. My personal experience of meditation is that it helps me vent the emotions which are building inside. So I sit down, I put on the app, a lot of emotion comes pouring out of me and I feel a lot calmer afterwards and able to get on with my day. Broken or unrestful sleep is one of the core symptoms of post-viral fatigue and may even be responsible for a number of the other symptoms, including emotional disturbance. One of the best £5.99s you'll ever spend is on Matthew Walker's book, Why We Sleep. In it, he talks about the studies that show how short night's sleep affect our ability to regulate emotion, amongst everything else. And if you're struggling anyway, a particularly bad night's sleep is all you need. So there are some very good practices around sleep hygiene that I won't go into here, but I would say that anything that you can do that improves the quality of your night's sleep is massively worth doing. Therapy. I don't think much therapy is happening in person at the moment, but a session over Zoom or Skype is 95% as effective. Good therapy might not resolve your post-viral fatigue, but it certainly will help with depression. I can recommend it. And some basics here too. It's hard when you don't have a lot of energy, but try not to fall back on the quick, easy meals or ready-made food. Try to eat as well as you can and get your 5 a day. Drink plenty of fluids and talk to people if you can bear to. I know when you're feeling down, when you're feeling withdrawn, it's very difficult to want to reach out. But if you've got any friends of yours who feel vaguely comfortable talking about feelings and you feel vaguely able that you might be able to, you almost certainly will feel better after a chat, whether it's 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 2 minutes. Talking to people, if you don't have people around you can talk to, pick up the phone and get on the blower. And finally, kindness. Depression has this peculiar ability to make us rather inward-looking, self-focused and withdrawn. But if you can find it in yourself to do one small random act of kindness a day, you might be surprised at the positive effect it can have, not just for the person, animal or plant receiving the act, but also for yourself. It changes your state of mind, makes you look outwards, and also helps give your brain a bit of the chemical reward that it's not been getting enough of. Now, one subject you might notice I haven't talked about is medication. And that's because the pharmacological treatment of depression is a huge, complex, controversial subject, and that's not ground I feel able to cover in this film. This is a tough time for so many people. So if there's one thing I want to say in this film, it's this. However much it might feel like it, you're not alone if you're struggling a little bit. And I know this for sure because I am too. And you know what? I'm going to stick my neck out a little bit here and say, unless you're 80 plus years old and lived through the world wars, this is probably the time globally when the most people on the planet have been suffering simultaneously from mental health issues at the same time. There is a particularly brutal set of pressures out there right now, especially if your health is letting you down. In fact, look, see, I just said letting you down. That's an insight into my inner expectation of a certain amount of ability. That in itself is a trap. So that's how easy it is. The first step, after all, is always acknowledgement. If you've got this far in the film, you're probably already there. The next steps are just ahead of you. So very finally, a message to all of the people out there who've commented on my previous films. I hope that you are feeling some degree of recovery in the last few weeks, something that gives you some idea of progression, or at least some idea about how best to manage the condition as it's presenting itself at the moment. Thank you for writing, thank you for sharing your stories. I think the cumulative effects of those on everybody else who's been reading them has been huge, so thank you. So yeah, look after yourselves, stay safe, till next time.